Hi everyone. Welcome to Unit 6, Indian National Movement. Course, BSHF 101 Foundation Course in Humanities and Social Sciences. Objectives of this course is to comprehend the various factors which led to the growth of national consciousness, know about the nationalist activities leading to the formation of the Indian National Congress, understand about the emergence of the Swadeshi movement and its impact on the future course of nationalist politics. Learn about the various movements launched under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi and the Congress. Know about some older movements in complementary relationship with the Congress-led movements. Here is a mind map diagram on Indian national movement. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. The Indian national movement arose as a result of the basic contradiction between the colonial rule and the Indian people. The colonial government in India, whose strings were attached to and which was guided by the imperialist government in Britain and which worked for the benefits of the merchants, capitalists and aristocrats of Britain, was a totally foreign government. It never worked in the interest of the Indian people. It was this exploitative and foreign character of the British colonial rule in India that gave rise to various revolts by the Indians against this government. This also resulted in the rise of the national movement in the second half of the 19th century. The Indian intelligentsia, which had earlier believed in the benevolence of the British rule, now criticized it for exploiting the country and draining away its resources. Under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi, the Congress launched three big mass movements: non-cooperation movement, civil disobedience movement and Quit India movement, which shook the foundations of the British rule in India. Besides these mass movements, some other movements such as the revolutionary terrorist movement, the peasant movement and the workers' movement, also played important roles in the Indian struggle for freedom. Here is a mind map diagram on Indian national movement. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. As we have pointed out in the introduction, the main reason for the rise of nationalism was the contradiction between the colonial regime and the Indian people. The exploitative and alien character of the British rule led to the resentment and many uprisings among the Indians. To maintain effective control of the government, the British adopted several measures. But these measures also helped the Indians to evolve a conception of Indian nationalism, centralized administration and economic unification. The main thrust of the colonial rule was towards centralization. It strove to govern the British-ruled portion of India from a single center. It also created a unified system of administration. Thus the military, police, judiciary, revenue collection departments and various other system of governance were made uniform for the whole of British-ruled territories. Many of the princely states also tended to follow the British pattern. At another level, the colonial government also tried to create a unified market in order to sell its industrial goods without hindrance. The import of machine-made goods from England destroyed the Indian artisanal industry, and the working of revenue policies tended to erode the rural and local self-sufficient economy. These developments created conditions for economic unification of the country. Printing press. Printing press was introduced in India during the colonial rule. With the help of the printing press, ideas and opinions could be disseminated to a mass audience with very low cost. Its impact was almost revolutionary. Many of these newspapers and magazines were nationalist, and in their columns the government policies were discussed and criticized. The Indians were asked to protest against such policies, and the ideas of nationalism, democracy and self-government were propagated. Some important nationalist newspapers of the period were the Amrit Bazar Patrika, the Indian Mirror and the Som Prakash in Bengal, the Maratha, the Kasari, the Native Opinion, the Hindu Prakash in Bombay, the Hindu, the Swadesh Mitran, the Andhra Prakasika, and the Kerala Patriku in Madras, the Advocate, the Hindustani and the Azad in UP, and the Tribune, and the Kohinoor in the Punjab. Even those who could not read might come to know about various happenings in the country and abroad by listening to the news read by someone else. Communication channels. Postal and telegraph services could be used to send messages across the length and width of the country. The railway could carry the people with much greater speed to various parts of the country. Although these were introduced to facilitate the sending of official messages and for carrying the troops for the rulers and to carry raw materials and goods for the British merchants, they also helped to facilitate better communication among the Indians. New system of education. The new education system was created to train the Indians to serve as a low-cost source of the clerical and lower administrative posts. The main aim of this initiative was, in the words of Thomas Macaulay, to create a class of persons, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals and in intellect. In other words, besides providing a cheap source of clerical labor, these Indians were also supposed to act as the most loyal subjects of the British. But the idea did not work as expected. The system of English education also instilled the ideas of liberty and equality. It also helped in the rise of national consciousness, discriminatory character of British rule. In their daily interaction with the British, the middle-class Indians realized that they were being discriminated on racial grounds. The English men and women and other Europeans considered the Indians as inferior even when the Indians were better educated and wealthier than themselves. All Indians, irrespective of their class, educational background, caste and status, were kept out of European clubs and were generally not permitted to travel in the same compartments of the train in which Europeans were traveling. In military, police, in government offices and in judicial matters, everywhere the dur of the skin, and not the merit, was the deciding factor. The Indians felt very humiliated. The most glaring instance of racism surfaced at the time when the Liberty Bill was proposed in 1883, when Ripon was the viceroy. According to this bill, Indian district magistrate and session judges could now try Europeans in criminal cases. Until now the Indian judges could not sit during the trial of the Europeans. The Europeans in India bitterly and abusively opposed this bill and forced the viceroy to amend it. This was a big shock even for the most moderate of the Indian leaders. Here is a mind map diagram on Indian national movement. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. 1. Early political associations. The first Modem Association in India was formed in 1837. It was the Landholders' Society, which was an association of the landlords of the Bengal Presidency. It was not a nationalist organization, but was mainly interested in protecting the class interests of the landlords in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. In 1843, association named Bengal British India Society was formed. Its interests were more general and its members were from among the educated classes. These associations represented the interests of the landed gentry and sent petitions seeking changes in the charter of the East India Company when it was to be renewed in 1853. Other associations which were nationalist in character and sought to represent the interests of the Indian people as a whole were formed later. East India Association was founded in 1866 in London by Dadabhai Naoroji, Feroz Shah Mehta, Badruddin Kabiji, and Manmohan Ghose. Its aim was to orient the policies of the colonial government towards the welfare of the Indian people by appealing to the British citizens. In 1870, Pune Sarvajanik Sabha was formed by M.G. Ranade, S.H. Chiplunkat and others in Bombay Presidency. 1. Early political associations. In 1876, the Indian Association was formed by the young nationalists in Bengal who were disenchanted by the policies and activities of the British India Association. Surendranath Banerjee and Anand Mohan Bose were their leaders. It sought to unite the Indian people and carried agitations against government policies harmful to the Indians. Some other political associations formed during this period were the Madras Mahajan Sabha in 1881, Bombay Presidency Association in 1885 and the Allahabad Peoples. These associations created a political atmosphere which was suitable for the formation of an all-India nationalist political organization. 2. Formation of Indian National Congress. The Indian Congress was formed in 1885. Its first meeting was held on December 28, 1885 in Bombay. Its first president was W. C. Banerjee and it was attended by 72 delegates from all over India. A.O. Hume, an Englishman who had retired from the Indian civil service, played a significant role in this process. This view has acquired credibility because Hume himself stated that the formation of the Congress was required because a safety valve for the escape of great and growing forces generated by our own action was urgently needed. In fact, Hume did believe that a popular outbreak was imminent because these poor men were pervaded with a sense of hopelessness of the existing state of affairs, that they were convinced that they would starve and die, and that they wanted to do something. He believed that the best way to check this popular insurrection was to help form an all-India body which would mediate between the discontented masses and the colonial authorities. Whatever may be Hume's beliefs, it is difficult to prove that a major popular revolt was imminent. In fact, the formation of the Congress should be seen as a logical culmination of the nationalist activities since the 1860s and 1870s. 2. Formation of Indian National Congress. As we discussed in the earlier sections, the British policies in India were generating a sense of discontent among most classes of Indians. Nationalist ideas were being disseminated through the various newspapers and magazines published in various Indian languages and in English. Various nationalist political associations were trying to create public opinion against the colonial policies. All these ideas and activities led to the formation of the Indian National Congress. Its goal was to create unity, intimacy and friendship among all the Indians from various linguistic, regional and religious background. It further aimed at expressing the views of educated Indians on the important problems of the day, including the colonial policies. The early nationalists constantly wrote and spoke about the need for constitutional reforms which would give the Indians a more effective voice in the governance of their own country. 2. Formation of Indian National Congress. They also complained that the country was growing poorer under the British rule, that India's wealth was taken away to Britain through various means, that the traditional Indian industries were destroyed through the import of foreign machine-made goods, that India's modem industries were suffering due to faulty government policies about tariff, that Indian taxpayers were forced to pay for colonial expansionism in Afghanistan and Burma, and the Indian peasants were sinking in increasing poverty because of increasing revenue demand. Although the early nationalists adopted peaceful and legal methods of campaign, their constant criticism of the colonial government made the British authorities angry. Dufferin, the then viceroy, attacked the Congress leaders as disloyal Babus, seditious Brahmins and violent villains. He said that the government cannot allow the Congress to continue to exist. And Curzon, later expressed the hope in 1900 that the Congress is tottering to its fall, and one of my great ambitions, while in India, is to assist it to a peaceful demise. 3. Moderates and extremists. In the first 20 years of its existence the Congress remained a moderate organization. It was dominated by leaders who were known as moderates due to their peaceful methods of political work and their belief in the good sense of the colonial rulers. These leaders thought that if public opinion was created, both in India and in Britain, and if reasonable demands were presented to the authorities, they would succeed in their goal. The moderates had faith in the British Parliament and the British people and carried out propaganda in Britain to influence public opinion there. In 1889, a committee of the Indian National Congress was founded in Britain. In 1890 a journal titled India was started there, and many mans were sent to Britain to campaign for the nationalist cause. The moderates, instead, believed in the good intentions of the colonial rulers and thought that if the true state of affairs was known to the British authorities, they would take the proper steps to correct the wrong. For this purpose, they used constitutional means and sent petitions and memorials to the government. 4. Moderates and extremists. The extremist or militant nationalists did not believe in these methods. They thought that the British would not heed the advice of the nationalists unless strong pressure was brought on them. According to the extremists, the trust in the good intentions of the colonial rulers was misplaced. The Indians, instead, should rely on their own resources to improve their conditions. But this could not be done under the foreign rule. Aurobindo Ghosh, another leader, attacked the very foundation of the Western civilization and asserted that the Indians should oppose not only the political aspects of the foreign rule, but also abandon the foreign goods, foreign dress, foreign language and foreign habits and manners. The most important leaders of the extremist wing were Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Bipin Chandra Pal, Aurobindo Ghosh, and Lala Lajpat Rai. The Swadeshi movement provided a spark which intensified this clash and increased the division between them. In 1907, at Surat Congress, there was a split in the Congress. The two wings were united in 1916. The Swadeshi movement radically questioned the earlier, moderate approach of petitioning and praying to the colonial government for concessions. It was also a rejection of the political program of the moderates. It set the goal of self-government for the Indians and, for this purpose, it adopted the method of boycott of foreign goods, passive resistance, disobedience of colonial authority and mobilization of the masses. All these methods of agitation dealt a severe blow to the constitutional methods of the moderates and heralded a new phase in history of the national movement. The Swadeshi movement started as a reaction to the partition of Bengal in July 1905. But there were many other reasons for it. It was now clear that the constitutional approach of the early nationalists and their trust in the good intentions of the rulers were not bearing any fruits. The government was becoming more suspicious and its officials were showing more racial arrogance. Even the most modest demands of the nationalists were not conceded. In fact, the rule of the Viceroy Curzon was the exact opposite of the nationalist expectations. In 1899, Curzon reduced the number of elected members, mostly Indians, in Calcutta Corporation. Similarly, in 1904, the number of elected members, again Indians, in Calcutta University Senate was cut down. For some time the colonial government was considering the idea to partition Bengal to stem the tide of growing nationalist movement. In December 1903 the partition proposals became known to the people. Throughout the year 1904 and the first half of 1905, various meetings were held in Bengal and memoranda were presented to the government for reconsideration. There was quick response to this high-handed action of the colonial government. Numerous protest meetings were held all over Bengal in which the decision to boycott foreign goods was taken. On August 7, 1905 the Swadeshi movement was formally declared. From now on the people were advised to boycott all foreign goods, particularly British goods like Manchester cloth and Liverpool salt. Many processions were taken out and people went to bathe in the Ganges and tied rakis on each other's wrist to signify unity. Huge meetings attended by thousands of people were held all over the city. Slogans of Swadeshi and Swaraj were taken up not only in Bengal but in many other provinces as well, and Bande Mataram became a popular song during this period. The British government tried to repress the movement severely. Meetings were prohibited, political activists were imprisoned, newspapers were banned, important leaders were deported and processionists were beaten up. The government also tried to divide the people along religious and regional lines. Due to this repression by the government, the youth resorted to revolutionary terrorism. Anushalan and Jugantar were two important revolutionary groups which emerged during this period. They did not follow the mass politics but believed in the politics of bomb and individual assassination to avenge the repressive measures taken by the authorities. Thus we see that Swadeshi movement inaugurated a new phase in the Indian national movement. The moderate methods of appealing to the government was now over and the base of the movement had expanded. Students, women and many other sections of the middle classes now became involved. Here are a few questions with answers. You can pause the video at any time to go through the questions and answers in detail. The Swadeshi movement declined by 1907. There was also a split in the Congress in 1907 and Tilak was imprisoned and deported in 1908. Aurobindo Ghosh and Bipin Chandra Pal retired from politics and Lala Lajpat Rai left India for some time. All these developments led to a decline in the nationalist movement. It remained dormant for a few years but was revived during the First World War. Annie Besant and Tilak started the Home Rule Leagues and the two wings of the Congress united in 1916. However, the most important development was the arrival of Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, who was later popularly known as Mahatma Gandhi, from South Africa. In South Africa, Gandhi had fought for the rights of the Indians against the racist regime. From 1919 to 1947, when India attained independence, Gandhi remained the foremost leader of the national movement. Gandhi arrived in India on January 9, 1915. In Champaran, which was in North Bihar, the indigo planters were forcing the peasants to grow indigo even when it was not profitable for the peasants to do so. In fact, the peasants were suffering losses by cultivating indigo in their most fertile lands. Gandhi was invited by the peasants to lead their struggle against the indigo planters who enjoyed the support of the colonial state. Gandhi went there to lead the struggle of the peasants and was successful to get them relief. In Kheda district of Gujarat, most of the crops were damaged due to excessive rain. The peasants of Kheda demanded from the government that they should be allowed not to pay the revenue for that particular year. The government, however, refused. Gandhi started a Satyagraha movement on March 22, 1918 and advised the peasants not to pay revenue. Many peasants participated in the movement. But the government refused to budge. The agitation continued for some time. But Gandhi realized that it was not possible for the peasants to continue for long. Meanwhile, the government granted some concession to the poorer peasants. In Ahmedabad, Gandhi led the struggle of the workers for an increase in the wages due to rising prices during the war. After a protracted struggle, the workers were able to get 35% raise in their wages. These struggles demonstrated to the Indian people Gandhi's method of political struggle and his principles of non-violent non-cooperation. They, on the other hand, helped Gandhi to familiarize himself with the Indian situation and understand the strengths and weaknesses of the Indian people. They also attracted many political workers who were to prove valuable in the future struggles. During the First World War, the prices of various commodities the conditions of the people worsened and the government extracted many dues from the people in the name of war efforts. This gave rise to resentment among the Indian people and there were several agitation against the government. To contain this, the government passed the Rowlatt Act in March 1919 which authorized the government to arrest any person without warrant and to detain him, her without trial for 2 years. There were massive protests and demonstrations by the Indian people against this measure of the government. Gandhi also took very active part in this. He started a Satyagraha Sabha which campaigned against this act asking people to disobey it one court arrest. In the Punjab, this repression took its worst form and in the Jallianwala Bagh the military under General Dyer shot at unarmed people without warning. Hundreds of persons, men, women and children, died. This Jallianwala Bagh massacre and the subsequent imposition of martial law in the Punjab horrified the whole country and generated anger against the British rule. Around the same time, the Indian Muslims were aroused because the Sultan of Turkey was deposed by the British. The Indian Muslims regarded the Turkish Sultan as their Khalifa and they started the Khilafat movement for the restoration of Khalifa in Turkey. Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali were the leaders of the movement. They called upon Gandhi to guide them. Although that movement was not directly concerned with Indian politics, Gandhi thought that in this then was an opportunity to unite the Hindu and Muslims against the British. Gandhi had decided to simultaneously launch the non-cooperation movement at an all-India level. In September 1920, in a special session of the All India Congress Committee held in Calcutta, it was decided to launch the movement. The Indian people were asked to boycott foreign goods and adopt Swadeshi, to boycott government school, colleges and courts and councils, to adopt national schools, arbitration courts and Qadi. The movement started at an unprecedented level. Thousands of students left schools and colleges, hundreds of lawyers and many government servants left their jobs. Most of the people refused to vote in the elections to the legislatures. The boycott of foreign cloth assumed massive proportions. Thousands were involved in the picketing of the shops selling foreign cloth and liquor, and in many places, peasants and workers were also involved along with students, middle classes and women. Most sections of the Indian population became politicized and women were drawn to the movement. An anti-imperialist feeling spread to wide areas of the country and the movement imbued the Indian people with self-confidence and self-esteem. Such a big movement, however, did sometimes reach beyond the Gandhian tenet of nonviolence. On February 5, 1922, in Chorai Chora, a crowd of peasants burnt the police station, killing 22 policemen in retaliation to the police firing. Gandhi condemned this incident and withdrew the movement. This decision shocked many Congress people, but Gandhi remained adamant and started a 5-day fast as penance. This way the non-cooperation movement came to an end. The sudden withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement demoralized the Congress leaders and workers and led to a decline in political activities. But the appointment of the Simon Commission on November 8, 1927 again raised the political temperature. This commission was constituted to explore the possibility for further constitutional progress in India, but there was not even a single Indian in it. This meant that the British government did not have any faith in the ability of the Indians. The Congress further decided to protest against it. Strikes and demonstrations were held wherever the commission went. This movement galvanized the country and stirred the youth and created the ground for a new India movement. In the annual session of the Indian National Congress held in Lahore in 1929, the resolution declaring Purna Swaraj, complete independence, as the goal was passed. And on March 12, 1930, Gandhi launched the new phase of the national movement. This new movement, known as the Civil Disobedience Movement, started with the historic Dandi March by Gandhi along with his 78 followers. He walked from his Sabarmati ashram to Dandi, a coastal village in Gujarat, and made salt in violation of the law. There were massive protests against his arrest all over the country. Lakhs of people came out on the streets for demonstrations and meetings. There were strikes all over. Shops selling foreign goods were picketed, Khadi and charkha were encouraged, hundreds of people left their jobs and thousands of students left their schools and colleges. In Bombay, Sholapur and other industrial centers, the workers went on strikes and staged massive demonstrations. In certain areas, the peasants stopped paying taxes. Seeing the public mood, the British government invited the Congress for a round-table conference to talk about the important issues. Despite the opposition of many of Congress leaders and workers, Gandhi agreed to participate and suspended the agitation and sign what is known as the Gandhi-Irwin Pact. However, the round-table conference failed because the British government did not concede Congress demands. The civil disobedience was started again. But it was not very effective this time as the momentum had decreased. The government heavily repressed the movement. About 1 lakh of Congress activists were arrested, meetings and demonstrations were banned, nationalist literature was prohibited and the nationalist press was suppressed. The Congress withdrew the movement in May 1934. In 1935, a new legislation was introduced which widened the franchise. On this basis, elections were held in 1937. The Congress contested the elections and formed governments in many provinces. In 1939, when the Second World War broke out, the British government declared without consulting any of the Indian representatives that India was also a party to the war. It was on August 8, 1942 that the Congress announced the Quit India movement. Gandhi exhorted the people to do or die. As this movement lacked a central command and the government repression was at its highest, violence broke out everywhere. Railway stations, post offices and police stations were burnt down. Railway lines and telephone and telegraph wires were cut. In many areas, parallel governments were set up. Strikes and demonstrations were also organized and people attacked and disrupted the government transport system. The government replied with further repression. Thousands were killed and many more arrested. Although the government was able to crush the movement, it was now apparent that people wanted freedom from the foreign rule and they were prepared to use violence to this end. Here is a mind map diagram on Indian national movement. You can pause the video here to view it in detail. The national movement gave voice to already existing anti-imperialist and patriotic sentiments among various sections of the population. Under its influence and sometimes independently, many movements emerged which fed into the broad nationalist stream. They widened the base of the nationalist movement by influencing Indian national movement, those sections of the population which the Congress-led movement had been unable to do. In this section we will discuss some of those movements. 1. Revolutionary terrorist movement. This trend became quite noticeable in the Indian politics only since the 1907-08. However, some earlier instances of such activities may be cited even in the earlier period. In 1897 the Chapekar brothers of Pune had assassinated 2 British officers who were responsible for brutally enforcing plague measures in the city. In 1904, V.D. Savarkar and his brother Ganesh Savarkar had established the Mitra Mail and Abhinav Bharata secret societies in Maharashtra. But the real emergence of this trend as an ideological and political force can be traced to the period after the repression of the Swadeshi movement by the government. The young people realized that the government was not going to listen to the Indians unless extreme pressure was brought on them. They also quickly politicized the Indian people by undertaking extreme action which they termed as the propaganda by deed. Thus in April 1908, Khudiram Bose and Prafulla Chakki threw a bomb on the carriage of the notorious district judge of Muzaffarpur. Unfortunately, due to misunderstanding, 2 British ladies were unwittingly killed. Chakki shot himself and Khudiram Bose, who was only 15-year-old, was hanged by the British government. 1. Revolutionary terrorist movement. Such actions by the government created resentment among the Indians and many other revolutionary groups were formed. The members of these groups attacked the high-handed British officials to avenge the injustice done to the Indians. Between 1908 and 1918, it was estimated that 186 revolutionaries were either killed or imprisoned or deported by the colonial government. In the 1920s, after the withdrawal of the non-cooperation movement, another wave of this movement arose. Ram Prasad Bismil, Chandrasekhar Azad, Bhagat Singh, Rajguru, Batuk Chhor Dutt and Sukhdev were some of the well-known revolutionaries in this period. They also formed an important organization known as the Hindustan Socialist Republican Association, HSRA. These revolutionaries became a source of inspiration for the young people and contributed greatly to the cause of the national movement. 2. Peasant movement. Right since the establishment of the British rule in India, the peasantry had risen in revolt time and again against the oppressive British policies. Exorbitant revenue and rent demands, the imposition of an oppressive class of landlords, forced eviction and insecurity of tenure, imposition of atrocious forest laws, forced labor and supplies, the growth of greedy money-lending class in the rural areas and huge indebtedness were some of the reasons behind these uprisings. The Sannyasi Rebellion, the Santhal Uprising, the Munda Revolt, the Coal Rebellion and many such peasant and tribal uprisings took place even before the nationalist movement had started. Once the nationalist movement started, many peasant movements were influenced modern India by it and these movements, in their turn, helped in widening the base of the national movement. Some of the important movements of the 20th century were those in Champaran in Bihar, Kheda in Gujarat, Awadh in Up, Malabar in Kerala, Rampa region of Andhra Pradesh, Bardoli in Gujarat, and Midnapur in Bengal. The formation of All India Kisan Sabha in 1936 was a major step in the nationwide awakening of the peasantry. 3. Workers' movement. Right since 1890s we find instances of strikes and protests by the workers in Bombay and Calcutta. This trend continued in the first 2 decades of the 20th century. But from 1919 onwards we witness a qualitative change in the working class struggles. The high prices and relatively low wages during the war years, 1914-18, made the conditions of the workers miserable. When their demand for increased wages was not conceded, they turned militant and held long-drawn strikes. In Madras, Bombay, Calcutta, Ahmedabad and among the railway workers many big strikes took place. To coordinate these struggles, the All India Trade Union Congress, ATUC, was formed in October 1920. Lala Lajpat Rai was its first president. C.R. Das, Jawaharlal Nehru, and Subhas Bose presided over some other ATUC sessions. Working class movement continued in the 1920s and 1930s. It was expressed in the form of many general strikes in almost all important industrial centers. During this period, the working class movement in most places was under communist influence. Many working class organizations of this period like Gurney Kamgar Union in Bombay were led by the communists. 4. People's movements in princely states. There were hundreds of princely states in colonial India. They were spread over 2/5 of the total Indian territory. The British indirectly exercised power through them as these states were completely subservient to them. The rulers of these states were generally autocratic and spent lavishly. The people were burdened with enormous taxes and led miserable lives. When the national movement developed in British India, it also influenced the people of these states. Many local organizations emerged in these states during the non-cooperation movement. In 1927, an All India States People's Conference was formed to coordinate political activities in the states. Popular struggles was launched in many of these states such as Hyderabad, Jaipur, Rajkot, Kashmir, Baroda, Mysore, Kathiawad, Jamnagar, Indore, Nawanagar, and Travancore. Earlier the Congress was reluctant to support these movements. But after 1937 the Congress started supporting these popular movements in the states and opposed their suppression by the rulers of these regimes. 4. People's movements in princely states. In 1938, the Congress included these states in its vision of independent and democratic India. By 1942, the people of the states were included in the movement launched by the Congress. From now on, the Congress maintained no distinction between British India and these states. Here are a few questions with answers. You can pause the video at any time to go through the questions and answers in detail.